For 5 days, Japan was on the verge of a terrible nuclear cataclysm caused by a powerful earthquake.
It will destroy Japan.
The series, based on real events, begins with Masao Yoshida, the head of the Fukushima 1 nuclear power plant, going to a hearing of the Accident Investigation Committee. Sitting in front of the members of the commission, Yoshida wonders what was the true cause of what happened. Human mistakes or ruthless fate. The action is postponed to the 11th of March 2000 of the 11th year. A normal working day is in full swing in the administration of the station. Yoshida paternally checks the work of subordinates, clarifying that the planned maintenance of the 5th and 6th power units is almost completed. Suddenly, the building begins to shake from tremors. An earthquake triggers an alarm. The hardware employees receive signals about the emergency shutdown of the 1st and 2nd power units. The staff proceeds to stop them by introducing control rods. However, by the time the tremors stopped, both units had lost external power, forcing staff to start emergency diesel generators to complete the shutdown mode. The earthquake forces Prime Minister Shinji Otizuma to interrupt the meeting of the commission investigating the case of his corruption. The headquarters for the elimination of the consequences of the accident has been established in the main office of the energy company. Vice President Murakami deals with the situation by calling all employees from vacation. According to the latest data, the Fukushima 1 shutdown threatens to completely de-energize Tokyo. To prevent this from happening, it is necessary to figure out how to restore power supply. But the situation is aggravated by the fact that more than 30 power plants on the coast have suspended work. Meanwhile, at the station itself, personnel are being urgently evacuated to a safe distance. In the control room, an excessively rapid pressure drop in the reactor is detected. 2 workers are sent to the engine room. At the 4th power unit, the coolant level drops, which forces the attendant to send 2 employees to check. One of them, Kurihara, manages to call his family before leaving to make sure they are okay. Employees evacuating in the rear guard see a wave of water coming out of the ocean much larger than expected. The tsunami turns out to be higher than the protective dam. A huge mass of water rolls over it and floods the station, crushing cars and flooding buildings. 2 pairs of employees face the elements, receiving various injuries and a threat to life due to the failure of all systems caused by the flooding of emergency generators. Soon the wave subsides, and the water rolls back into the sea, leaving behind a pile of junk and devastation. But the situation does not get better from this. The hardware staff tries to restore the cooling of the reactors when the power supply disappears completely. An emergency situation is reported to the Prime Minister and Vice President of the energy company, but it is not possible to obtain up-to-date data on the state of the equipment. Yoshida reports to the director that 2 operators have disappeared and their fate is unknown. In case it is not possible to restore power to the generators, he tells the assistant Kinosiv to call fire trucks to fill the reactors with water. At this time, the duty team in the de-energized control room comes to a similar conclusion that they will have to look for an emergency way to pump water to cool the reactors. Due to the combination of circumstances, the Prime Minister from Zuma declares a nuclear emergency, as repair work is difficult due to the effects of the tsunami. However, the headquarters for the elimination of the accident is in no hurry to begin evacuating residents of nearby settlements around the Fukushima 1 station, as required by the regulations. The complete unknown aggravates the already unsettled situation. Even the station's employees, led by Yoshida, are not aware of how things are going in the power units. In order to somehow clarify the situation, the head of the control room, Mr. Winter, sends 2 employees to the reactors, simultaneously setting a sentry on the roof. Warn if another tsunami is drawn. Armed with a Geiger counter and lanterns, the workers descend into the basement. While the sentry on the roof is peering into the night, illuminating the ocean with a flashlight, the staff below is getting close to the reactor door. The meter emits the first beep, informing about the threat of radioactive radiation. The senior decides to return in order to report the leak. Yoshida is allocated 2 fire trucks to cool the reactor, which he reports to the control room. Madzima also sends employees to open valves for water supply. They are headed by an experienced and elderly employee of the truck, who volunteered. This should be done quickly before the growing radiation level reaches a critical threshold. When they descend into the underground corridors, a small shock happens. Furu reassures the young that if new tremors cause a tsunami, they will be warned in advance. They move on and soon open the first of the 5 valves. Continuing to make their way in the dark and dropping flashlights, the detachment of workers opens the remaining valves, eventually getting to the last one, gradually gaining the level of radiation. At this time, a portable generator is connected in the hardware room. The activated sensors show the water level. It is lower than necessary. This is reported to the emergency response headquarters, warning that dehumidification in the upper part of the core will take place in an hour, which will lead to a chain reaction and cause the destruction of the reactor in 2 hours. The Prime Minister orders the evacuation to begin, simultaneously clearing the road to bring mobile generators to the station. Murakami clarifies the radius and, having descended to a zone of 3 kilometers, gives the order. Journalists at a press conference clarify what happened, that the government changed its mind so quickly on this issue. Mobile generators are brought to the station, but the switchboards were washed away by salty sea water after the tsunami. It is completely unclear which of the 70 shields are in working condition. The check will take a lot of time, and that's exactly what is missing right now. Looking at the clock, Director Yoshida realizes that right now the rods are starting to melt, starting an irreversible process. Moving through the territory of the station is complicated by the devastation of the blocking road left by the tsunami. Despite this, workers are laying cables from generators to power units, risking their lives. The remaining seawater hides the broken manholes of the sewer, where it is easy to drown. Yoshida reports from the control room that pressure is also increasing on the protective shell of the first power unit. This indicates that the reactor cooling is not working. This is reported to the Prime Minister, warning that the increase in pressure is fraught with a catastrophe of the Chernobyl level. The station director decides to open the ventilation valve to release steam and thus relieve pressure. However, the Prime Minister is against such a plan. This is fraught with the release of radioactive elements into the atmosphere. But they convince him by putting him in front of the fact. Disasters are already inevitable. But if nothing is done, its consequences will be much more destructive, and the radiation fund, deadlier. The head of the hardware made Winter is forced to appoint volunteers who will manually open the valve, risking their lives. He himself is called first, but immediately the subordinate raises his hand. He is ready to go instead of the boss, who is better to lead the operation. The plan is this: there are 3 groups of 2 people from among those who are older. Yoshi brought the workers to provide the volunteers with the best tools and protection that they have. At the same time, the family of the Kurihara station employee learns that he is missing. It also turns out that the Prime Minister from Zuma is flying to Fukushima on a visit. There is a beautiful view of the station from the side of his helicopter. TV crews with due piety are filming the visit of the Prime Minister, who is dissatisfied with the current situation and the need to undergo disinfection procedures. He demands to start ventilation of the protective shell immediately, but Director Yoshida explains that without electricity, the only way to open the valve is. This is done manually by the reactor addition. At the same time, those who go to perform the task are most likely to die from intense radiation. More time is needed to minimize the risks. Mate Winter mentors volunteers. Having received an order from the director, he gives the go-ahead to start the operation. Armed with oxygen cylinders and dosimeters, the first pair approaches the reactor building, forced to accelerate due to the radiation background higher than expected. Having made their way through the narrow corridors of the reactor building, they find the desired valve. He, though not immediately, but succumbs. The workers return to the control room to report on the successful completion. However, this is only half the case. The second group needs to open the valve directly above the pool with contaminated water. Having made their way to the right room, they realize that the dose of radiation threatens to become fatal. Opinions are divided. One offers to return, the other wants to risk his life for a good cause. After a small fight, they return to the control room without reaching the valve. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister's office receives a report on potential pollution around the station. The figures cause one of the secretaries to have terrible memories of the accident of 1999 and the employees who died from radiation exposure. At the same time, Kurihara's family is informed that he most likely drowned in the basement during a flood caused by a tsunami. At the station, the hardware staff, realizing that there is nothing more they can do, asks Majima for permission to leave their jobs. However, he shames his colleagues, reminding them that the residents of the surrounding settlements hope that they will fulfill their duty to the end. The assistant director of Kinasoda volunteers in the control room to replace the employees who have already received a dose of radiation. He invites another citizen named Todanu with him. When they are ready to go out, Yoshida suggests trying to open the valve remotely using a compressor. Arriving at the place, they undergo a disinfection process in cold water, washing away possible contamination with radioactive dust. But even so, the dosimeters go off scale, forcing you to wash off the dirt again. Immediately after that, the volunteers go to the control room, where the staff is preparing for the next stage to minimize possible consequences. However, the employees are not eager to let Kinoshita and his partner go to certain death, despite the fact that he knows the internal location of the reactor building better than others. Nevertheless, the newcomers convince Winter that they will cope faster than the rest. While Kinoshita and Totina are putting on protective suits and preparing to go in search of the valve, Yoshida is reporting some news. He immediately calls the control room and tells them to stop the third team. But they are already out, and Majima has to run after them. The truck picks up the abandoned phone and learns that white smoke is coming from the pipe of the first reactor. This is the steam released from the shell. The valve could be opened remotely using a compressor. The pressure inside the protective shell is falling. To restore the cooling of the reactor, the staff is preparing to conduct water there, but there are not enough supplies. Yoshi-do orders to establish supplies from the ocean, despite the height of 10 meters. While the subordinates are thinking how to pull it off, another tremor happens, after which the director reports that the 5th floor of the reactor building has collapsed. Yoshida goes outside to personally check out the scale of the tragedy. There are a lot of wounded people around who are reporting bad news. The reactor building exploded. The directors themselves see clouds of smoke around what used to be the first power unit.
A large cloud of smoke has risen over the power plant and seems to have gone north.
News about the explosion of the reactor gets on television. The Prime Minister sees the report earlier than he was informed from the station. Around the destroyed shell of the first power unit is full of wounded from among those who stretched hoses for water supply. The primary task in the current conditions is to restore the water supply for cooling the reactor. Employees attract self-defense forces, having decided to lay fire hoses in a new way, but now not from tanks, but from the ocean. Despite the fact that the use of salt water will render the reactor unusable. At the same time, at the headquarters of the elimination of accidents, politicians will learn about the need for rolling blackouts, otherwise Tokyo will be completely without electricity for several days. Yoshida is told not to use seawater to cool the reactor until the cabinet of the minister is convinced of the safety of this decision. But the work is already underway, and the director refuses to give the command to stop until the last. Only when the management of the energy company insistently hints to him, Yoshida defiantly gives an order to stop work. But this is just a trick. In fact, the laying of hoses is already being completed. But even when politicians give the go-ahead to let seawater into the reactor, it does not come in any way. Meanwhile, the pressure inside the 3rd power unit begins to rise, which threatens a new explosion. To reduce it, it is necessary to get to the valve, in the same way as on the 1st power unit. Winter comes and equips another group. But she can't get to the right place because of the radiation and returns. Yoshida reports that soon the fuel rods will bare and begin to melt. Also, the liquidation headquarters is concerned about the fact that a similar situation may happen at other power units. The 2nd and 4th. To relieve pressure by ventilation, you need to open a malicious valve. The director offers Kaneshito an option to power it remotely from car batteries, for which workers remove batteries from cars. The collected batteries are connected to a single network to increase power, but even this is not enough to open the valve. Employees are not discouraged and plan to add more batteries to the network. However, they do not have time. Director Yoshida, in the form of an increase in pressure, understands that there will soon be a new explosion. He announces evacuation and orders all employees who work near the reactor building to leave there. However, when he reports this to the liquidation headquarters, subordinates report that the valve has been opened, and the pressure inside the protective shell of the 3rd power unit is falling. Yoshi says to continue work on providing the reactors with water for cooling. A car with workers rolls to the 3rd power unit to lay a water hose. Suddenly, she is turned over by a shock wave. Feeling the tremors, Yoshida runs up to the window and sees a column of smoke going into the sky. The 3rd power unit ordered to live for a long time. After getting out of the overturned car, the station workers return back to the main building. Along the way, they inspect the wreckage, looking for other victims. None of them were seriously injured. Having abandoned the transport that has fallen into disrepair, the group moves on. A little later, they stumble upon colleagues who were less fortunate and help to drag the wounded, despite the threat of radiation. On TV, journalists spread the recording of the explosion of the 3rd power unit. The Prime Minister learns from Zoom that plutonium got into the atmosphere together with the hurricane, which increases the level of the accident to Chernobyl in terms of pollution. Yoshida reports that an increase in temperature is also recorded at the 4th power unit. 1,500 fuel assemblies are stored there. If the fuel runs out, things will dramatically get much worse. Survivors of the explosion of the 3rd power unit get to a safe building, where they receive first aid. Yasuda is glad that all the employees survived, but the joy is premature. Pressure is also increasing at the 2nd power unit. Carefully fueled by the media, the panic reaches the point that people on the internet are already blaming the missing Kiriharu and his partner. The accident was their fault, they ran away themselves. The relatives, listening to the discussions on TV, are not too happy, although the mother says that in this case she would be happy. Yoshida receives valuable instructions from the liquidation headquarters, to which they react excessively violently, and they ask not to interfere with employees doing their best. At this time, they are bringing fire hoses to the 4th power unit, simultaneously clearing the rubble in front of the entrance. Checking the water level, the staff stumbles upon the body of the drowned Kurihara and his partner, which is reported to the director. He emotionally perceives the sad news. Next, the control room reports that the fuel rods of the 2nd unit are bare and are not cooled by water. Yoshida is forced to think about the urgent evacuation of personnel, so that they all do not die from radiation here. if the rest of the power units explode. He calls Murakami at the liquidation headquarters to get permission to withdraw people, all except those who will stay voluntarily. The Prime Minister is informed about the request. He is immediately against it, but after learning that the evacuation will be partial, he gives the go-ahead. Nevertheless, doubting the methods of the energy company, the Prime Minister takes the leadership of the liquidation headquarters into his own hands and calls on the senior managers of the station to sacrifice themselves for the benefit of others. High-ranking employees have to sacrifice themselves, just like me. In response, Yoshida takes off his pants and publicly scratches his ass, after which he tells his subordinates to continue working. In the early morning of the 15th of March, Fukushima 1 is shaken by another explosion, after which the radiation level rises sharply. After the report of the employees, Yoshida thinks that the remnants of the second power unit have exploded, and repeatedly requests evacuation, leaving a minimum of personnel to supply water. But the decision of who will stay is made by employees collectively and voluntarily. Some of the staff gets on buses and leaves the dangerous territory. Young employees have become a priority for evacuation. But even so, not all of them immediately obeyed the order, preferring to stay on duty until the end and feeling guilty for abandoning colleagues. The operators remaining at the station, before starting work, write letters to their relatives together, not knowing whether they will see each other again or not. After that, they arrange a small friendly snack, trying to morally support each other and cheer each other up. From the internal news of the video taken from the helicopter, it becomes clear that the fourth power unit exploded last. The outer protective shell is destroyed. Meanwhile, Kiriharu's relatives are informed that his body has been found. The Prime Minister reports that foreigners are leaving the country en masse, apparently on the advice of their governments. Next comes a specialist who shows a visual illustration of the consequences of pollution in case the accident cannot be localized. We are talking about 54 million people and a third of the country's territory that will become uninhabitable. Next, the military reports that they can't do anything, but they will continue to try. Meanwhile, a fire truck, whose pump was used to pump water into the cooling system, fails at the station itself. Yoshida calls the veteran firefighter Araki to ask for advice, and he volunteers to come personally to help. The president calls the Prime Minister. He orders an urgent evacuation of all Americans. At the station, they notice that less and less white smoke is rising from the destroyed outer shells. This indicates that there is little cooling water left. Soon the staff is joined by volunteers from among the elderly specialists, eager to protect relatives from a potential disaster. Murakami from the headquarters suggests that Yoshida use construction pumps that supply concrete to the upper floors to draw ocean water to the desired height. While concrete pumps are being started and deployed, the military is dumping water on reactor buildings from helicopters. By joint efforts, the liquidators manage to fill the reactor with water. This leads to a decrease in temperature and stabilization of the reactor. The media spread information that Japan refused to accept the latest cooling materials from the United States, which played a role, despite the fact that the information turned out to be unreliable. Nevertheless, as soon as the situation stabilized, the Navy was there to valiantly provide secondary humanitarian assistance. Soon the situation is under control. After the crisis, the work of the staff gradually returned to normal. Yoshida had to continue to manage people in order to minimize risks and pollution in the current conditions, as well as compile a bunch of reports to understand exactly what happened and in what sequence. After a while, Kuriharu's family arrives in Fukushima to identify the deceased from the photo and take the body. The director reports that only 2 employees died directly during the accident. Nevertheless, work on cooling the shutdown reactors continued. A month later, mentally and physically exhausted employees were not even surprised by the bloody urine, knowing full well that the health problem was still to come. Under the cutting of archival video chronicles, Yoshida tells in a voiceover that Japan, having recovered from defeat in World War II, began to develop economically. Such growth required a huge amount of energy, and to ensure it was necessary to build nuclear power plants, one of which was Fukushima 1. But instead of a symbol of a bright and happy future, it turned into a real nightmare and is now slowly disappearing into oblivion in the process of dismantling. In January 2000 of the 17th year, the Japanese were convinced with the help of technology that the bowels of the station are still full of radioactive waste and unused fuel. At the beginning of the 2019 year, it became known that the alloy had hardened and could be moved, but first you need to figure out how to extract it and where to store it later. Until now, no one knows exactly when the reactors will finally be decommissioned. Residents of the surrounding areas had to leave their homes forever, leaving behind overgrown houses and streets. More than 100,000 people were evacuated. An exclusion zone was built around the nuclear power plant, even sakura was cut down around it. Only stalkers were not brought in. Fukushima 1 itself is still a dark spot of human arrogance on the ocean shore under the boundless blue sky. Yoshida himself found out after the accident that he had cancer, but blames it not on radiation, but on stress at work and years of smoking. He wants to spend the rest of his time usefully, to share with his descendants the experience accumulated in those days. The series ends with an information certificate stating that Yoshida died on the 9th of June, 2013 year, 2 years after the accident. Interviews with more than 90 liquidators of the accident formed the basis of the book and this series, although some moments were deliberately dramatized. The consequences of the Fukushima 1 accident have not yet been eliminated. The work continues to this day.